Welcome to This Explainer. Imagine a world just balancing on a knife's edge, right? Utterly unaware of the absolute catastrophe about to unfold. Today, we're looking at an event that literally shattered the globe. It's the story of how a single isolated spark cascaded into a terrifying fire that changed the course of human history forever. The sheer scale of what we're about to cover is honestly staggering, especially when you consider the toll.
16 million. 16 million people lost their lives. It's an almost incomprehensible number, isn't it? What began as an assassination swiftly evolved into an industrial-scale slaughter, ending millions of lives and entirely erasing the world as we knew it.
And it wasn't just a staggering loss of human life. The geopolitical destruction was absolute. 4 mighty, centuries-old empires just collapsed under the sheer weight of this war. The entire global hierarchy was completely dismantled, just left in ruins. But how exactly did the world go from a state of peace to the total destruction of global empires?
Part 1. The Spark and Alliances, Europe in 1914. Okay, let's dive into this. So, picture the summer of 1914. Europe was a total powder keg of competing empires and massive armies. You had these powerful, industrialized nations aggressively competing for global influence, stockpiling weapons, forming these incredibly complex networks of alliances, and then the match was struck. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. Now, initially, this might have seemed like a regional, localized tragedy, but because of those simmering tensions we just talked about, the domino effect was breathtakingly fast. Just weeks later, almost all of Europe is actively fighting. The descent into chaos was immediate.
The escalation happened so incredibly fast because Europe had basically locked itself into these really rigid military alliances. You had the Allied powers on one side and the Central Powers on the other. This diplomatic framework essentially guaranteed that if one nation got pulled into a conflict, well, they were going to drag all their allies right in with them. It turned what really should have been a manageable crisis into this massive, continent-spanning war machine.
Part 2. A global war begins. The scope expands.
So what do we actually mean by a global war? It's a massive conflict that pulls in entire nations and continents. Those intertwined defense agreements we just looked at, they acted exactly like tripwires. What started as a regional dispute aggressively mutated into the largest war the world had ever seen. Countries were just joining the fray, one by one, drawn entirely into the inferno. The spark had caught fire, and the scope of a war was expanding uncontrollably across borders. A conflict anywhere meant a conflict everywhere.
Part 3. Realities of Modern Warfare, the Microview.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that pivoting from the grand strategy of empires down to the ground level reveals an incredibly stark, brutal contrast. While leaders were pointing at grand maps, millions of young soldiers spent years trapped in muddy trenches. The daily realities were just horrific. We're talking rampant disease, crippling hunger, suffocating mud, and just constant, agonizing danger. This wasn't a war of glorious cavalry charges. It was a grueling, static nightmare of survival.
And making that trench reality even worse was the introduction of deadly new technologies. World War I brought us machine guns capable of just mowing down lines of infantry. It introduced the suffocating horror of poison gas, the crushing mechanical force of tanks, and fighter planes that took the violence straight into the skies. It was this massive leap forward in technological progress, but it was applied entirely to massive human devastation. It completely transformed warfare forever. Part 4. Battles and Turning Points, the Cost of War.
Verdun, the Somme, Gallipoli. Even today, these names carry a heavy, incredibly somber weight. They weren't just battles, they were absolute meat grinders. Truly, they stand as some of the bloodiest engagements in all of human history. Millions of lives were sacrificed in these specific campaigns, and the crazy part is, they were often fighting over just a few miles of destroyed Earth. The sheer scale of the cost for such minimal territorial gains is just heartbreaking.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive shift by 1917. This is the ultimate turning point of the war. On one side, you have the United States entering the conflict, pouring fresh troops and vital resources into the Allied effort. On the other side, the Central Powers are facing absolutely exhausted economies and armies that are desperately struggling just to continue fighting. The balance of power had decisively, permanently shifted.
Part 5. The Collapse and Aftermath, Reshaping the World.
After that turning point, the end arrived with rapid acceleration. The United States brings its might in 1917, and just a year later, the German alliance collapses. Finally, on November 11, 1918, the armistice is signed. The crowds celebrate.
After 4 years of relentless industrial slaughter, the guns finally fell silent, and the fighting stopped. So, the crucial point is that the consequences of this 4-year conflict were absolute. Millions upon millions were killed. The map of the world was completely rewritten as national borders were drastically redrawn. And those old, mighty empires we talked about at the very beginning, completely destroyed. The First World War didn't just end a conflict, it ended an entire era of human civilization.
Listen to this and let it resonate for a second. World War I lasted only 4 years, but its impact shaped the next century of human history. It's a profound truth. The modern world we navigate today, our borders, our global politics, our international organizations, all of it traces its roots directly back to the mud and the treaties of 1918.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and I want to leave you with this really provocative question. Given the destroyed empires, the drastically redrawn borders, and the incredible global tension left in its wake, did the end of the First World War merely create the very conditions that set the stage for the Second World War? It's a fascinating and honestly chilling thought. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this critical piece of history. Let that question sink in and keep learning.